We live together. We act on and react to one another. But always and in all circumstances, we are by ourselves. The martyrs go hand in hand into the arena. They are crucified alone. Embraced, the lovers desperately try to fuse their insulated ecstasies into a single self-transcendence. In vain. By its very nature, every embodied spirit is doomed to suffer and enjoy solitude. Sensations, feelings, insights, fancies, all these are private, and, except through symbols and at a second hand, incommunicable. We can pull information about experiences, but never the experiences themselves. These words were penned by Aldous Huxley, in a famous essay titled The Doors of Perception, and it captures the fundamental problem of psychology, which is that it is impossible to ascertain another individual's subjective mental experience. Each of us is alone in our own minds, and unable to share our inner feelings, perceptions, and thoughts with others. However, this fact has not stopped people from trying to find new methods by which they could give expression to their internal states. During the 20th century, psychology became elevated as more and more curious people sought windows into their own minds to explore the world within. Many psychological schools arose claiming to give full accounts of the human psyche, and from such insights, it was believed that we would be able to treat mental illnesses. This revolution was accompanied by experimental forms of art, wherein artists attempted to use new mediums to give form to their inner psychological experiences. However, during this grand exploration of the human soul, new discoveries gave the Western world brand new methods with which their inner, unconscious psychology could be illuminated. The discovery of LSD by Albert Hofmann in 1938 sparked a brand new period of experimentation, as it appeared that this new tool provided unparalleled access to the mind, as Stanislav Grad, a psychologist who ran experiments with LSD, noted. The capacity of psychedelic drugs to exteriorize otherwise invisible phenomena and make them the subject of scientific investigation gives these substances a unique potential as research tools for the exploration of the human mind. It does not seem inappropriate or an exaggeration to compare their potential significance for psychiatry to that of the microscope for medicine or the telescope for astronomy. It was also becoming apparent that an ancient form of religion known as shamanism had been inducing altered states of consciousness for thousands of years, using specific mind-altering compounds such as ayahuasca, iboga, and peyote. Huxley became increasingly interested with the peyote cactus after learning that Native Americans living in northern Mexico consumed the cactus and revered it as a god. It was discovered that the active agent in the cactus was a drug known as mescaline, which could purportedly cause profound alterations to human consciousness. Amidst the backdrop of this widespread interest and exploration into the realms of the human psyche, Huxley consumed 0.4 of a gram of mescaline and recorded his observations. He was particularly interested in being able to view himself and the world from a brand new perspective, to get outside and reach beyond his typical worldview. Soon, he began to report on what he was observing. Half an hour after swallowing the drug, I became aware of a slow dance of golden lights. A little later, there were sumptuous red surfaces swelling and expanding from bright nodes of energy that vibrated with a continuously changing, patterned life. At another time, the closing of my eyes revealed a complex of gray structures, within which pale bluish spheres kept emerging into intense solidity, and, having emerged, would slide noiselessly upwards, out of sight. He soon became fixated on a flower vase, staring intensely at the flowers, which seemed to glow with some unfathomable transience. I continued to look at the flowers, and in their living light I seemed to detect the qualitative equivalent of breathing, but of a breathing without returns to a starting point, with no recurrent ebbs, but only a repeated flow from beauty to heightened beauty, from deeper to ever deeper meaning. Words like grace and transfiguration came to mind, and this, of course, was what, among other things, they stood for. My eyes traveled from the rose to the carnation, and from that feathery incandescence to the smooth scrolls of sentient amethyst, which were the iris. Everything in the room appeared to Huxley to be imbued with a deeper meaning, as he became increasingly alienated from his ego. Mundane objects glowed with an indescribable beauty, as though they were exquisite works of art. Even something as simple as the furniture in the room elicited a deep feeling of wonderment, as he became more attentive to the subtle details. The legs, for example, of that chair. How miraculous their tubularity, how supernatural their polished smoothness. I spent several minutes, or was it several centuries, not merely gazing at those bamboo legs, but actually being them, or rather being myself in them, or, to be still more accurate, for I was not involved in the case, nor in a certain sense were they, being not self in the not self which was the chair. This experience allowed Huxley to closely examine the true nature of the human mind, which is that its function seems primarily to narrow perception, not widen it. Or as philosopher Charlie Broad writes, the function of the brain and nervous system and sense organs is in the main eliminative and not productive. Each person is at each moment capable of remembering all that has ever happened to him, and of perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. The function of the brain and nervous system is to protect us from being overwhelmed and confused by this mass of largely useless and irrelevant knowledge, by shutting out most of what we should otherwise perceive or remember at any moment, and leaving only that very small and special selection, which is likely to be practically useful. In other words, the mind can be thought of as a reducing valve, which constrains the totality of our perception to that which is actually relevant to survival. We are sentient of a huge number of perceptions at any given time, but only a tiny proportion of these ever become conscious. So while we are constantly perceiving a wide range of experiences, our brains filter most of this out. This wider field of awareness, to which we can potentially be conscious, is called by Huxley mind at large, and the mind acts as a sort of filter to prevent all of these perceptions from overwhelming us. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which will help us to stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. Mescaline, as well as other psychedelic compounds and shamanic techniques, appear to open the so-called reducing valve, allowing our minds to focus on details that would have otherwise been filtered out. People who have psychedelic experiences report having an unusual interest in subtle details, which they may have never noticed before. Normally, the mind does not pay any attention to these insignificant details, but the unrestrained mind can't help but be fascinated by, for instance, the veins of a leaf, the individual grains in a clump of sand, or the individual hairs on your skin. Indeed, much of what is experienced during a psychedelic episode isn't necessarily a hallucination. It is simply your mind paying more attention to what you hadn't noticed before. You can make note of many things right now which, although you perceive them, often do not come to your attention. For instance, your nose is always present in your visual field, but your mind naturally filters this image out, just as it filters the feeling of air touching your skin, or the taste inside your mouth, or the smell inside of your nose. Within your eyes are subtle structures, which are called entopic phenomena, which give rise to certain visual patterns, and like most things we experience, are normally cognitively filtered out. With psychedelics, all of these things begin to be re-experienced as though they were brand new, and no longer relegated to the subconscious mind, which is why psychedelic experiences produced a renewed attention to subtleties which may have been ignored previously. One prominent example of this is color perception, as psychedelics can draw our attention to shades and hues which we may have never taken note of before, allowing our minds to differentiate multiple colors in our environments, rather than mentally blending similar hues together. Mescaline raises all colors to a higher power, and makes the percipient aware of innumerable fine shades of difference, to which, at ordinary times, he is completely blind. This seems to have an analogous effect with sounds, especially with music, where it becomes possible to hear subtleties in music which are ordinarily unheard. Through cultivating these altered states of awareness, We open our minds, so to speak, to the true complexity of the world, where we can deeply ponder the true wonder of the universe. This state of mind is normally experienced in the life of every child. Children experience the world in all of its fullness with few cognitive restraints, and the world is experienced as strange and unfamiliar. As kids, we are more easily engrossed in our environments, a feeling which becomes diminished as we grow older. This type of perception is sometimes referred to as sheer perception, where, for example, this car would be perceived as a raw mass of shapes and colors without any coherent identity. But as we grow older, our minds stop focusing on these details and see the object as a whole. In autistic children, this ability is retained into adulthood, which is one of the reasons why people with autism experience the world in the way they do. In this sense, altered states of consciousness return us to a state of childlike wonderment, where the world is much more fascinating and beautiful. As Huxley writes, visual impressions are greatly intensified, and the eye recovers some of the perceptual innocence of childhood, when the sensum was not immediately and automatically subordinated to the concept. The formation of a cognitive reducing valve is partially a consequence of our language, which enables us to simplify the world, quickly categorizing people, things, and places according to our language schema, just as these objects elicit an immediate sense of recognition because our language allows us to efficiently organize our sense perceptions without needing to analyze each detail. Other states of consciousness are also similar to experiencing mescaline. During a mescaline experience, it often feels like a person's will has been diminished, as though they are beginning to lose control over their thoughts and actions, as the ego structure widens and gradually dissolves, as frequently occurs in schizophrenia. The schizophrenic is like a man permanently under the influence of mescaline, and therefore unable to shut off the experience of a reality which he is not holy enough to live with, which he cannot explain away because it is most stubborn of primary facts, and which, because it never permits him to look at the world with merely human eyes, scares him into interpreting its unremitting strangeness, its burning intensity of significance, as the manifestations of human or even cosmic malevolence, calling for the most desperate countermeasures, from murderous violence at one end of the scale to catatonia or psychological suicide at the other. And once embarked upon the infernal road, one would never be able to stop. The theory of the reducing valve, which modern psychology is largely in agreement with, helps to explain differences in cognition between individuals, and can make you wonder how much of your mind falls beneath the threshold of consciousness. Cognitive experiences of the world and fields of perceptibility may differ between individuals. Many artists who are able to give attention to details, which ordinarily seem mundane, probably experience consciousness in a less limited way than on average, giving them the ability to create new forms of expression. What the rest of us see only under the influence of mescaline, the artist is congenitally equipped to see all of the time. His perception is not limited to what is biologically or socially useful. A little of the knowledge belonging to mind at large oozes past the reducing valve of brain and ego into his consciousness. It is a knowledge of the intrinsic significance of every existent. Those who are artistically and creatively gifted are able to release their minds from the cognitive restraints of the reducing valve, and more easily see the beauty in the world. These states of mind can be reached with many techniques, including dehydration, meditation, or through entheogenic compounds. It might be tempting then to believe that the best way to live would be with an open reducing valve, minimally constrained. But if we perpetually lived in this state, it would no doubt do harm. The reducing valve evolved as an evolutionary advantage, which allows us to extract information from our environments quickly, without becoming mesmerized by the details. A brain that isn't constrained by the cognitive reducing valve perceives the world with fresh eyes, which allows one to deeply ponder the nature of existence, fathoming the deep interconnectedness of all things, and the oneness of this mysterious universe. But this state of mind, if ever cultivated through shamanic practices, should only ever be glimpsed for a short duration before the valve is shut and consciousness is restored to normal. Huxley closes the essay by commenting on the human urge to be removed from our ordinary state of consciousness, as humans have been using drugs to alter their minds for thousands of years. The urge to transcend self-conscious selfhood is, as I have said, a principal appetite of the soul. However, it is much more common to use drugs such as coffee, tobacco, and alcohol than psychedelic compounds, and keep in mind that this was well before the so-called war on drugs came into effect. Aldous Huxley believed that we could benefit by allowing people to journey into the recesses of their own minds, provided they could do so safely. This may have certain psychological benefits for the treatment of mental health disorders, but it can also be an intellectual endeavor, to experiment with one's own consciousness, and to understand the extent to which the human mind remains a mystery. To be shaken out of the ruts of ordinary perception, to be shown for a few timeless hours the outer and the inner world, not as they appear to an animal obsessed with survival or to a human being obsessed with words and notions, but as they are apprehended, directly and unconditionally, by mind at large. This is an experience of inestimable value to everyone, and especially to the intellectual.